Hello again, everybody. A pleasant day to all, and welcome to our latest episode of Facts Talk podcast. This project is made possible through the collaboration between Facts Asia and the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung Philippines. Nice to be back. Here I am, Diane Querer. I'm a TV host and news anchor based in the Philippines. Well, here in Facts Talk, we will examine Europe's strategy for cooperation in the Indo-Pacific. And today, we will focus on the fourth priority area for cooperation, and that is digital governance and partnerships. Well, in the past few years, European states have been actively engaging in the Indo-Pacific. Last year, Facts Asia and CAS Philippines launched a compilation of special articles that tell us how European states have significant interests in the region, including their policy recommendations for cooperation between the Philippines, ASEAN, and the European Union. Just to have a recap, in our first episode, we tackled the area of sustainable and inclusive prosperity and discussed significant aspects of economic partnership. In our second episode on green transition, we tackled EU's important role in responding to the issues of climate change and environmental degradation in Southeast Asia. Now, in this episode, we will talk about the developments in digital governance and partnerships concerning Indo-Pacific states and EU foreign policy. The EU in particular aims to work with partners to expand the network of digital partnerships with Indo-Pacific partners and explore potential new digital partnership agreements and strengthen cooperation on research and innovation with like-minded regional partners under the Horizon Europe program. Now, joining us today is our very special guest, Dr. Giulia Ajmone Marsan, Director for Strategy and Partnership Economic Research Institute for ASEAN and East Asia. Good day, Dr. Giulia, and welcome to Facts Talk podcast.
Thank you, Diane, and thank you to the entire team at Facts Asia and also CAS for having me here.
So, Dr. Giulia, before we take a deep dive on the fourth priority area of cooperation, we want to know more about you. Briefly, can you tell us what you do and your expertise about our subject matter for today?
Good morning to everybody. I'm delighted to be here, as I was mentioning before. As Diane mentioned, I work at the Economic Research Institute for ASEAN and East Asia, and I am an innovation economist by background. This means that I have been analyzing and providing advice to governments all over the world, from Latin America, Europe, Asia, North America, and many other locations about the development of innovation ecosystems. And as we know, a lot of innovation is driven by digital technologies today. And this is why I'm really delighted to have the chance to discuss about partnerships related to the digital realm between the Indo-Pacific region and Europe.
Now, Dr. Giulia, it's time to focus this time on digital governance and partnerships. How will you define this, and why is this important for the EU?
Well, I think this is very important for everybody on this planet, across the EU and across the Indo-Pacific region. And this is because I think we know it very well, especially after the pandemic. The digital economy, digital technologies are everywhere. They are pervasive and affecting radically the way we work, the way we live, the way we interact. Therefore, it's extremely important to think about how to develop and deploy digital technologies, but also what are the effects, and therefore what kind of governance, what type of regulation we need to put in place. At the end, it's us human beings developing the technologies and deciding how to use it. And we also, we are the one in the driving seat when thinking about which are the rules of the game and which are the rules of the game that we want to develop. This is very important for both the EU and ASEAN. And the reason is that when we look at the Indo-Pacific, some of the economies in these areas are amongst the fastest growing digital economies in the world. So the rate of deployment and also the pace of innovation and technology is really advancing very, very fast. And this is also why regulation becomes important, because when you have such a fast acceleration and transition, this is where, there are lots of opportunities being created, but there are also challenges that are emerging. So there are differences between the two areas. We know that the Indo-Pacific is a very diverse area in terms of economic development, for instance, with countries with very, very different institutional settings. But at the same time, a lot of the challenges and the issues are somehow similar. And this is where there's a lot of opportunities for mutual learning, capacity building, exchanges of good practices between the EU and the Indo-Pacific region and Southeast Asia in particular.
I must agree with you that digital technologies are indeed everywhere. And digital technology is important to you and me and to all of us. Now, this time, Dr. Giulia, we want to know your views on these questions. What can the Indo-Pacific region learn from the EU's experience and approaches? And why is the EU interested to share its experiences through the EU strategy for cooperation?
Well, you mentioned it at the very beginning. Over the last few years, the Indo-Pacific region is becoming increasingly a prominent geopolitical area, and lots of groupings and countries around the world are defining strategies for the Indo-Pacific, and the EU is certainly one of them. So I think the EU wants to strengthen its engagement in the Indo-Pacific, and I'm sure that many of the listeners of this podcast are very much aware. For instance, there was last December in Brussels an EU ASEAN summit precisely, to promote collaboration, commonalities of intents in a number of different areas. And when you look at some of these strategic documents, the digital economy figures prominently. So it's always one of the areas identified for further engagement and collaboration. We know it very well. The EU is a kind of regulatory powerhouse, and that's because it's a very large common market, economic integrated area. So in a sense, the regulations that are being discussed at the EU level and implemented, improved or corrected and perfected, typically they have an impact in many other locations around the world. Think about the GDPR, but think also about the latest developments with respect to regulation of EI, or even privacy rules that are being defined at EU level. Often the EU has been a front runner and one of the first grouping around the world to discuss about what policymakers should do and what the rules of the game should be. I mean, let me use this phrase once again. So I think that even for Indo-Pacific countries, it's certainly a grouping to watch, because lots of ideas in terms of regulation and how we can again define this rule could be. Then obviously, I mean, different countries can go into different directions, but certainly the EU is a kind of interesting lab for regulations and ideas to come up. At the same time, I also believe that this idea of partnership and collaboration should really go both ways, because even EU countries, in a sense, have a lot to learn and let's say also a lot to watch when thinking about the Indo-Pacific. The ASEAN region, for instance, it's characterized by a young population. I mean, I know that some ASEAN countries are still are now being a little bit preoccupied about aging population, but still, I mean, the average age remains younger than the EU. The population is very much tech savvy and often mobile first. So, for instance, with respect to some characteristics, things about mobile payment, e-wallets, e-money, ASEAN, I mean, the usage of these tools is even more widespread than within the EU. So you see that I think that for both groupings, it could be very interesting to monitor developments, because in a sense, this idea of partnership, this idea of dialogue could actually prove to be very beneficial.
It is important for the EU to be at the forefront of digital governance then. Does it view other countries as competitors in digital governance, as to be the first ones to create the rules of the game?
Yes and no. Again, I mean, the EU has this advantage of being a supranational body, with a large internal market. So this is why, a lot of people around the world are looking at EU regulation. It's also, I mean, the EU integration, in a sense, I mean, it's an open form of economic integration, because the EU, I mean, is exporting and importing a lot of goods of services from over the world. And this is why, I mean, the issue of regulation becomes important, because if you are an entrepreneur across ASEAN and you want to export or develop services for the EU, of course, you need to be aware of the EU regulation. In a sense, this has an impact on your business and your business development plans. But yeah, at the same time, every big bloc around the world thinking about digital regulation is in a sense also in competition, because ideally, I mean, if we were living in a world where there was just one unique standard, it would be much simpler for entrepreneurs and companies to just, look at the standard. It's a global one. I don't need to be concerned and worried about, fragmentation of different regulations. It's a little bit both ways. So on one hand, the EU and EU citizens voting for EU elections. So on one hand, the EU, should define its own strategies according to what are the EU priorities in terms of many different areas, because this is something that is very challenging and complicated. You need to think about competition, you need to think about innovation, but you also need to think about privacy. You need to also think about people-centered AI or people-centered digital transformation, and sometimes there are trade-offs. So regulation in this area is not easy, it's complex, and it's also very much emerging. We are still in an emerging phase, and this is why there are now both competition and collaboration also amongst different standards, because we don't know what's going to be best. We don't know what are the impacts, what are the benefits, but also the potential negative impacts of some of these regulation. Now, there are different schools of thought. Some people saying we cannot regulate, it's too early, we're gonna kill innovation. I'm more in the school of thoughts that I think that some rules of the game need to be defined. I think this is very important, but at the same time, we also be cognizant of the fact that the rate of innovation is very fast, and therefore, we need to try, and we also need to be able to change the regulation when we see that there are some unintended consequences. And this is valid for every economy around the world. It's also valid for ASEAN. I know that ASEAN is looking at what the EU is doing, but ASEAN is also thinking about its own regulations and its own rules of the game for the digital economy and the digital transformation.
Now, Dr. Giulia, what are the distinctive features for cooperation and/or hard connectivity and soft connectivity potentials that may contribute to better cooperation between European states and the Indo-Pacific region?
I'm very happy that you're mentioning both hard and soft connectivity, because this is very important. Well, in a sense, there are endless opportunity for collaboration. On one hand, there are already actually agreements for EU, the EU as a whole, and EU member states to support the Indo-Pacific region and ASEAN in particular in building better infrastructure for digital. This is a priority for the region, because even if the digital transformation is happening very fast in ASEAN, there are emerging digital divides, which basically means that some places and some people, some groups of people in ASEAN are benefiting more from the digital transformation than others. If you think, at countries like what some people call archipelagic ASEAN, so the big archipelagos in the region, like the Philippines or Indonesia, for instance, two big countries in ASEAN, the level of digital infrastructure is very diverse. And this means that if we want, digital economies in ASEAN to thrive, this is an area for improvement, because not everybody, depending on where you live and who you are in the same position. Other types of divides are example between people, in more urban settings, rural settings, but also men and women. And this is something that, me and my team, we did some analysis. There's clear indication that, like, in many other places around the world, men and boys are benefiting more from the digital transformation than girls and women. So again, dialogue and partnerships with the EU can certainly try to identify these gaps and find ways, think together about ways to address these gaps and fix them. Because again, I think the time to fix them is now, because if we wait for too long, the risk is that these digital divides will become bigger rather than, smaller. So that's certainly, let's say, a possible risk for ASEAN. And this is certainly an area where the two regions can have, a mutual and win-win cooperation. And this is also bringing me, if you want, to the idea of soft connectivity, because even if infrastructure is extremely important, at the end, we need to have the skills, we need to have the mindset, we also need to have, the people-to-people connectivity to be able to develop partnerships and collaborate. And this is also an area where the EU is very well positioned. For instance, I'm sure that many of us are aware that through programs like Horizon Europe, or let's say more in general, the programs targeting innovation and science, technology, and innovation, there are a lot of opportunities for collaboration for the two regions, for the two economic blocs to collaborate. And this is something that could really, on one hand, improve the mutual understanding of the two regions, for instance, by common projects where ASEAN researchers, ASEAN scientists can work together with the EU scientists and researchers. On one hand, this promotes the mutual understanding of the two regions, and also, creates this kind of soft infrastructure, soft connectivity amongst people that can really be beneficial for years to come.
Dr. Giulia, you have already touched a bit on the gaps in digital transformation in the Indo-Pacific. On that note, what are the other challenges in the strategy for cooperation in digital governance?
There are both opportunities and challenges. I was really mentioning before in my previous answer, mutual understanding, because I think that even if it's very important to collaborate, and again, there are lots of opportunities, the two regions are not the same. And even within ASEAN, like within the EU, there's a lot of diversity. So there are countries with different institutional settings, different ways of being governed, which basically means that even if often, when you read the strategies around the digital economy or the digital transformation, you can identify common phrases: cybersecurity, privacy, people-centered digital transformation. It doesn't necessarily mean that everybody is interpreting these phrases in the same way. And that's, if you think about, sometimes, for instance, discussions about human rights could become very controversial. And this is something that, is mentioned in different ways within the EU, or, across different ASEAN member states. So this is why I really think it's important to understand, a better common understanding of, what are the different views of the world in different locations. I think this is very important to avoid disappointments, because, again, not everybody is thinking, along the same lines. And this is something that, should be understood. It doesn't mean that cooperation is not possible. I'm a strong believer that it's very important to understand different points of views, to then, understand where cooperation is possible, and also, to move the needle, because, by understanding different points of view, it's also a way to understand, how different viewpoints can, come and land, to a kind of a common middle ground, and also how things can improve in both areas. But I think this is something that it's important for many people in Europe and also in ASEAN to keep in mind, to define pragmatic and also ambitious strategies for collaboration.
Dr. Giulia, the EU embodies a human-centric approach in its digital economy, with the goal of technology serving the people, where human rights are respected and societies are open, democratic, and sustainable. As you mentioned, everybody has a different view on these concepts. Will the EU's approach hinder cooperation and digital partnerships between the EU and ASEAN member states? How can they navigate this challenge, Dr. Giulia?
It's very, very important to understand that sometimes, the way human rights are described in Europe may not be the same way as these kind of concepts are adopted or implemented in some ASEAN member states or some countries across the Indo-Pacific. So it's very important for European stakeholders to have a, let's say, acknowledgement of these and also knowledge about these issues. But I don't think that this should necessarily stop collaboration. Even if, there are different views across the different regions, this is why, I think, and I really believe that what I called before soft connectivity is especially important. Sometimes, when you just read, some reports or, statistics, these are the hard facts and, could become, how can I say, they could become blocking factors. But I think it's very important to create this people-to-people connectivity and, again, soft infrastructures to really bridge the differences. I think it's not, a kind of 0-1 switcher. So engaging in conversation and common projects is typically a very important channel to also, see how certain issues can be overcome and the situation can be improved across the different areas.
Dr. Giulia, in your personal view, what area should the EU and ASEAN prioritize when it comes to cooperation on digital governance? For instance, Singapore and the EU have already launched a digital partnership agreement. Can this be a basis for EU-ASEAN cooperation and digital connectivity? And what aspects of the cooperation could serve as the building blocks for the cooperation, Dr. Giulia?
That's certainly a good starting point. But I think that more in general, we are going to see a lot of collaboration in the digital sphere across basically almost most of the collaboration initiatives, because as I said at the beginning, the digital economy, digital transformation is so pervasive. We know that, for instance, in lots of trade agreements that are being negotiated with the EU, but not just with the EU, typically, there are chapters or provisions around the digital economy because it's becoming, again, such an important component of what we do when we trade, when we sell, when we export. Think about also data issues. So this, again, is an area where views are not always fully aligned. But I expect, it is already in a sense, and it will certainly become an area for, let's say, lots of discussion to try to find ways to promote collaboration and overcoming challenges because it's becoming increasingly a necessity. But I think that other areas that will be very, very important for collaboration are the ones, again, related to soft connectivity. Think about, again, the issue of skills. I think that other areas for collaboration, and to some extent it's already happening, is really the ones about how can we develop good programs to make sure that we are strengthening the skills for the digital transformation and digitalization more in general. This is a very important pressing need for both regions and ASEAN in particular. And I think this is also extremely important if we want to move forward with more inclusive digital economies in both ASEAN and the EU. And when we think about skills for the digital transformations, we need to really think across the spectrum. From primary education to higher education. And this, for instance, cooperation in the realm of higher education has been very fruitful across the EU and ASEAN. There have been programs even to promote, exchanges and harmonization of higher education systems across ASEAN. Also because within the EU, this is an area where the EU has been very successful. But we should also think about the skills for the digital transformation of people that are already in the workforce. Think about MSMEs, both within the EU and ASEAN, as probably everywhere in the world. MSMEs are key. They are, the majority of companies around, and are typically the ones that have a little bit less resources to be invested to upskills and reskills workers for the digital transformation or even the green transformation, if you think about it. So this is certainly an area where lots of programs for capacity building, exchange of practices can definitely be developed, because this is going to be absolutely key for the future. If we talk about inclusive digital transformation, we cannot forget about skills of people living in areas that are a little bit less served, but also we cannot forget about those companies that has less resources to train their workforce and invest in digital technologies. And this is very important once again, because we want companies to be able to compete as much as possible equally within the digital economy. And, if it's just, large corporations that have the chances to exploit and benefit from the digital transformation, the most, unfortunately, we will see divides and, let's say, gaps grow rather than, narrowing them down.
On that, I would like to thank you. Thank you, Dr. Giulia Ajmone Marsan. Thank you for sharing your expertise and highlighting the role and importance of soft connectivity and people-to-people relations, which is actually one of the goals of this project. Thank you very much for your time today.
Thank you, Diane.
To all our listeners who watch and listen to this podcast, thanks to all of you who joined us today. Now, if you loved and learned from this podcast, please share this episode with your friends and colleagues. Also, if you missed our previous episodes, you may also listen to the past episodes here in Spotify and other social media platforms. We invite you all as well to like and follow Facts Asia official social media accounts, facebook.com/FactsAsia on Facebook and at FactsAsia.org on Twitter. You may also visit our website, www.factsasia.org, to stay updated on our projects. That's all for now. Again, this is your host, Diane Carrera. Thank you for joining us. Until the next episode of Facts Talk.